Hello and thanks for joining me. Today I've brought you down to Newborough Forest, down by Llandwin Island on the coast of Anglesey. Now, I'll be quite honest with you, I would much rather be up the mountains. It's been an absolutely terrible winter, and yet again, the wind is absolutely savage. So I've come down to Newborough Forest instead, just to get some respite from the wind that's hurtling its way up the Irish Sea. Now, Newborough Forest actually is quite an interesting location. There's plenty to see and photograph. Most visiting photographers, of course, walk right past it on their way down to Llandwin Island, and rightly so. Llandwin Island's an amazing location. But if you do get the chance and you spend a bit of time on Anglesey, the forest is worth a look round. There's a few features about it that are quite interesting. First off, unlike a lot of purely deciduous forest, and this is all Corsican pines, it's got a really uneven floor, and that means there's all sorts of interesting angles, and because it's an old sand dune system, that you can use as part of your compositions to make things a bit more interesting. The trunks tend to grow really quite vertically, as you can see around me, and you can use that, juxtaposition it against the angle of the ground to make for some interesting shots. Today we've got some sunlight breaking through, which is quite nice because the forest isn't too thick. We can make use of that. And of course, another thing about it is there isn't a lot on the forest floor, so the trunks are separated and it makes isolating subjects a little bit easier. The other thing is, of course, it's huge. So even if the beach car park is heaving with visitors, when you head off into the forest, very quickly you'll find yourself completely alone, which is welcome relief sometimes living around here. Anyway, I don't have any specific shots in mind today. It's just desperation to get out with a camera, take some images, and also to make a video, because I really haven't done much lately. So thanks for coming along with me. Let's go and see what we can find. Now, oh, hang on. Just been waiting for the light. I was just about to start talking to you. I got a bit of sunlight on my subject. This particular image has a subject of a clump of marram grass at the base of some of these tree stumps. And I've got a shaft of light coming through the forest, and it's catching it beautifully. This is slightly unusual for the sort of thing you might see with landscape photography. I've got my aperture as wide open as it'll go. I'm going for a really shallow depth of field. What I want to do is to throw the background out of focus if I can. Problem with this lens is the widest aperture is f4, but I can do something with it in post to enhance the blur without too much difficulty. It's allowing me, with the wide open aperture and a bit of ISO dialed up to about 800, to get a shutter speed of about a 200th of a second, which is what I need to freeze the marram grass. I don't want any movement in it at all. Getting down nice and low and shooting down through the forest. I've got no sky to worry about. There's a grassy bank behind my subject, which I hopefully will be able to throw out of focus and really pop the subject out of the image. But yeah, that's the thing about wandering around this forest. You tend not to be pointing your camera at trees. It's more detail around the forest floor. So let me show you how I treated this image in post-processing. The standard import routine, as I mentioned in my last video, where it applies a very basic preset that's just in line with the characteristics of my camera's sensor. So that gets applied on import. And then all I've done in this first pass is a very slight crop adjustment. And then I've simply applied 3 graduated filters. Now the first graduated filters from the top of the image with an exposure reduction of just a smidgen over half a stop. Same sort of thing from the bottom as well, although only about 1/3 of a stop reduction because it was already pretty dark on the bottom. Then finally I've brought one in from the right hand side, again about half a stop, and the reason for that is the highlights on the bark of this tree are pretty bright, and you'll see in a moment when I apply contrast what it does to those. So this image is shipped over to Photoshop, and I start off with my sharpening layer. And then I add a bit of blur. Now I mentioned this when I was out in the forest. I'm not able to get the background separation that I wanted to, particularly with this tree due to the limitations of my lens. It'll only go as wide as f4. Now if I could get it down to say f2.8 or f1.8, I wouldn't have this problem. But of course I'd have a much chunkier piece of glass, or I'd be carrying a bag full of lenses, which I'm not prepared to do. So my workaround is to apply a Gaussian blur layer, and as you can see that's blurred the tree nicely. You can see I've got a mask here because obviously I don't want the Gaussian blur to be on my foreground, so I've masked it as required, and that's all I needed to do. Very quick and simple. It's a 5 pixel blur. Then my contrast layer, which as you can see has really punched up these highlights. Obviously that's what contrast does, boosts the highlights and drops the shadows. Now that's why I brought that graduated filter in Lightroom from the right hand side. So we're back in Lightroom now, and I showed you in my last video how I had lots of radial filters to do dodging and burning. Obviously I've done that with this, but in this particular instance I've also played with the colour balance quite significantly. Now what I found with this, I felt that it was too yellow. Whilst there was that shaft of sun, I think that overall the image has got too much yellow in it. So what I did was I dropped the temperature quite significantly, and you'll see it's taken all of the yellow hues out of the image and left me with a flat palette to play with. And what I've then done is I've split toned it. This is the effect of the split toning, and I'll show you what I did. I wanted to make these highlights more orange. I wanted to try and create something with a little more drama and something that would pop those highlights a little bit more expressively than the yellow that was captured by the camera. So I've pushed in some orange into the highlights, and then to counteract that, the complementary colour to that is turquoise or blue colour, and that's what I've used in the shadows. But with the saturation in the highlights, as you can see, my saturation slider is quite a long way over to the right, and normally with split toning you'd probably be slightly more cautious about that, but I like the overall effect on this, and the image lent itself to that process. That's the final image that I was able to create with that exposure. Classic landscape shot perhaps. Path disappearing through the forest. Nah, far too cheesy. Now I suppose it's fair to say with landscape photography, we all tend to follow the same sort of routine. We turn up at a location and we walk around and wait and see what catches our eye. In this instance, I've spotted something that seems to be completely unique around here. There's a tree with ivy spiralling around the lower part of the trunk. Now, every other tree in this entire forest that I've ever seen doesn't have any ivy on it, so goodness knows how it got there. But it's also just on a little hill and catching some sunlight. It hasn't really got much behind it. The trees in the distance are quite some way off, and you just get the sense of the trunks catching the light as they fade away. Again, as with my previous image, I've opened my aperture right up. I position myself back so that I'm shooting at about 80-90 millimeters, something like that. Don't need such a high ISO with this one because those leaves are quite bright, catching quite a lot of light. So I've left it down at the base ISO for this camera, which is 200. And what that's allowing me to do is to get a shutter speed of about 1/100th of a second. But because I don't have marram grass or anything like that blowing around in this composition, I can use the lower ISO. Yeah, this is all very much about featuring the ivy on that tree trunk. Now what I've done is compositionally, I've put it slightly off center, and then the background just, as I said, fades away to the faint tree trunks in the distance. Hopefully this one will be quite interesting. I'm just having a quick spin around this area, get some handhelds. As you can see, there's quite a few bits of dead foliage lying around, and I just want to grab a few shots and see if I can make anything of it. The lie of the land, as you can see, it's really steep, so it does kind of make it difficult to get in with a tripod. Well, it looks like I've lost the light for today. It's clouded over quite significantly, and I don't think that I'm going to have any more shafts of sunlight on the forest floor to play with. Not to worry. What I've done is switched over to a slightly different style. You'll see what I mean in a moment. I've come to an area where I've got two things that are interesting to me. One is quite a few fallen trees. Now that's not that common in this particular forest. The forest isn't very old. It was seeded in 1947 with these Corsican pines to stabilize the dune system. So it's nothing like, say, for example, the primordial forest that Gary Norman visited down at Dolgellau at Coed y Brenin a couple of weeks ago. Worth having a look at that video if you haven't yet. Some great woodland photography there from Gary. But anyway, this area that I'm in at the moment has got two things. One is the fallen trees. The other is that because it's an old dune system, I've got some quite interesting diagonals on the forest floor that I can work into my compositions. And it makes it much more interesting than forest photography where it's flat. So I'm using that. The ridges that are in this particular composition have got some marram grass on them, which is much lighter than all the surrounding vegetation. So with a bit of a boost in post, I can really pick out those diagonals. Now what I'm doing with this image, unlike most of what I do, I'm going deliberately black and white because there's next to no color in the forest anyway. So this is going to be about tone and texture. I've got a fallen log, and as you can see, I've got my tripod straddling the log. So the log is coming out underneath the bottom of the camera, obviously a leading line to an explosion of dead branches. I'm still shooting at f4 because I don't want the background sharp at all, and in fact with this particular setup even my foreground's a little bit soft because the log comes right out underneath the camera. I don't mind that at all. The log actually is quite a bit brighter than the surrounds, and I'm going to make use of that as well in post. One of the great advantages of modern digital cameras is I can set my screen to square crop, which is what I'm going to use, and set it to black and white so I can really see how the tones are working in it. I have got a tree in my composition that this tree has fallen against. Obviously, it's a full-size tree, I can't get rid of it. But what I've done is I've just kind of set my composition up so that the tree is on the left-hand third, but it's not too offensive because it is actually quite dark naturally. And with a bit of extra darkening in post, hopefully won't be too distracting from the explosion of branches that are my main subject. Anyway, let's see if there's anything else to be had before I get rained on. Now, the thing about this one is that it's hanging off this huge bank, which means I've got really good separation with the background. Well, even though this isn't the sort of thing that I normally do with my landscape photography, I've really enjoyed myself today, and it never hurts to challenge yourself to try something different. So I'm going to leave it there for this one. Thank you ever so much for joining me. I really hope you've enjoyed it, and if you have, why not subscribe now and join me next time. Cheers.